It's a tremendous pleasure and kavod to introduce our next shiur. We have the tremendous chus of having Rav Weiss, who is amongst the most renowned and respected international halachic authorities. He has a unique blend of extraordinary Torah knowledge and profound insight. Brings disciples to hear his shiurim, which are given weekly all over Eretz Yisrael. The Rav frequently lectures to groups of doctors, lawyers, other professionals seeking halachic guidance in their specialist fields. As a prolific writer, Rav Weiss has written a hugely popular series of chidushim on different mesechtes in the Gemara, and most recently a book on medical halachic issues from Tshuvas Minchas Asher, which was extremely well received by an unprecedented spectrum of the Jewish community. Rav Weiss is of Bestin at Beis Darchei Torah and the Rosh Kollel at Kol Minchas Asher in Yerushalayim, where Talmidei Chacham receive training in Psak and go on to serve communities as Rabbanim and Dayanim throughout Eretz Yisrael and abroad. The Rav is also the Rav in Pesach at Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim, where he is called upon to answer questions requiring this incredibly unique blend of Torah erudition, a medical background, and a unique sensitivity to the medical issues involved. It's a big zchus to have Rav Weiss join us.
Bruchim Abuim, Shalom Aleichem to all of you. This is my third opportunity to join the CHEMED conference. I think it is the third CHEMED conference. I'm not sure, but it is the third conference in which I have the zchus to participate. And before discussing the topic I was asked to discuss, I just want to say how important this conference is in my eyes. Recently, somebody met me in the middle of the street in Yerushalayim and he asked, is it true that I paskined that anyone that's not gonna be a Rav or a Yeshiva has to be a doctor? I said that would sound to me as a very silly psak. Can't paskin that you need to be either a rabbi or a doctor. But I do agree that the two most lofty endeavors and the two most important professions are either being a marbitz Torah or being a doctor. And the common denominator between the two is asiyas ritzon Hashem, caring for people, for their souls and their bodies. So the CHEMED conference is a wonderful blend and combination between an interaction, medical professionals and Rabbonim on one hand, enriching the knowledge of medical professionals in medical issues, whether it's medicine, physical, psychological, and shiurei Torah. So it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here together with you. So I was asked to discuss an artificial uterus. One could define the topic in two different ways. Do we actually mean an artificial uterus, which is something which is really non-existent, but what we call an artificial uterus is a new technological breakthrough which has been tried on lambs, and usually the nevertical lamb is always the first to bear the brunt of technological advance or medical advance. And we are dealing, well, we all are familiar with incubators, and the main cause of neonatal mortality is premature babies who are not fully developed. And for decades, we've had incubators to help save these little babies. But the new technological breakthrough is actually connecting to the umbilical cord and feeding the premature child with nutrients and fluids necessary to his development. And the hope is that we will be able to save premature babies that were born in a far earlier stage than we can today. So usually in hospitals throughout the world, we don't treat babies that were born before the 23rd week of pregnancy because the chances are so slim that these infants will survive. And if they do, they will be extremely compromised. So the general approach is not to treat babies that were born up to the 22nd or 23rd week of pregnancy. And with this new breakthrough, which some define as an artificial uterus, we might be able to save babies and give them a fair chance of proper life at a far earlier stage. I do not find any halachic discussion associated with this technological breakthrough, besides the question how we deal fundamentally with divrei Chazal that a ben shmoino cannot live. So we will briefly discuss the very philosophical assumption, nishtanu hateva, which is a fascinating discussion in Halacha with many sources. And then we will dedicate some of our time to what is far more relevant, which is a uterine transplant, not an artificial uterus, but rather transplanting a uterus from one woman to another, and the halachic discussions, implications, and questions associated with uterine transplant. So let's embark, first of all, to speak about Ben Shmoina Harei Hu Kemeis, and that is a Gemara in Shabbos of Kuf Lamed Hey Omud Beis. And it is interesting, in the eyes of Chazal, a child that was born in the 7th month of pregnancy has a din of a Ben Chai, and we are to do everything to save his life, even at the expense of Chilul Shabbos. But a child that was born in the 8th month, Chazal say, Ein mechalalen olav es Shabbos, and Chazal go to the extreme and say, Hareu ke'even, he is like a stone, v'oso letaltele b'Shabbos, he's actually muktzah. So these two halachas are associated with Shabbos. Ein mechalalen olav es Shabbos, we do not violate Shabbos for this child that was born prematurely. 8th month. 8th month is today a baby that has all the chances in the world. Sometimes you won't even need any special attention. But according to the Chazal, ein mechalalon olav es Shabbos, and he has a din of muktzah v'emetal telenoisoi. And a Masechet Machshirin Perek Vav, that is a halacha which is associated with Tumah v'Tahara. It has nothing to do with Hilchos Shabbos. Chazal go to the extreme, roikoi v'domoi einam machshirin, because he's not defined as a human being. So how do we relate to this assumption and these halachas, knowing what we know today about a child that was born in the 8th month, sometimes wouldn't even need any special medical attention? So there are two different interpretations. What do Chazal mean when they say Ein mechalelen olav es Shabbos? Rashi on the spot, Rambam Perek Aleph Halacha Yud Gimel Hilchos Milah. Their interpretation is we cannot be mechal Shabbos when circumcising the child, but we definitely are mechal Shabbos trying to salvage him and to save his life. But the Torah in Siman Shin Lamed, as well as the Shulchan Aruch following the footsteps of the Torah, Siv Zayin, their pshat, their interpretation is we're not mechal Shabbos to even try to save the baby because it is extremely unlikely, maybe remote, that there will be any chance to save him. and therefore ein mechalelin olav es hashabbos. So the Imre Yosher, Rabbi Meir Arek, was one of the greatest poskim, greatest halachic authorities in pre-Holocaust Europe. Shalas Teshuvas Imre Yosher. He was the Rav of Tarnov. Chelak Aleph Simekuf Ayin Zayin. He writes that I heard that in Paris, I don't know why he mentions Paris, they invented a machine, like a box, in which they could save the life of a ben shmeina, of a child that was born prematurely. And he writes, nevertheless, I think the ruling of Chazal is still relevant, and we're not machal Shabbos to save this baby, and it seems to me still unlikely that his life could be saved. So I don't know what the situation was 100 years ago in Paris, but that is what the Imre Yosher relates to. On the other hand, the Chazon Ish, twice, Orach Chaim Kuf Nun Hey Sif Koten Daled, Even Ezer Kuf Tes Vav Sif Koten Daled, it's printed twice in the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says, we must assume that things have changed. And the Chazon Ish doesn't go into detail, but he writes, we find in the Rishonim, in more than one ish sugya, Nishtana HaTeva. So when would it be reasonable to say things have changed, and when would it be unreasonable to say so? So I want to briefly review 9 different sources that we find from the days of the Rishonim till the Achronim, in which we do find, when we deal with discrepancies or obvious contradictions between Chazal, the Mesodos of Halacha, and what we know today in science and in medicine, how we try to resolve these discrepancies. So the very first source we find in Toises twice in Shas, Pchodes Yutes Amid Beis, Avodah Zarah Chov Daled Amid Beis, dealing not with humans, but with animals. And the Gemara says that a cow would not bear offspring until it's 3 years old. And Tosis says, we know that animals have babies and have offspring far before 3 years of age. And Tosis says, Tzorech loimer, nishtane hateva. Chulin daf mem zayin amid aleph, the Gemara deals with how many lobes does a cow's lung have? And the Gemara says that wild cattle, wild horses, or other animals only have 2 lobes, and it is very uncommon that there is the unanisi de varda, which is a smaller 3rd lobe. And Tosa says, in our days, they all have this additional lobe, and unlike what the Gemara says, and Tosa says, once again, we need to assume things have changed since days of yore. Moed Kot Yud Aleph Omed Aleph, the Gemara says that fish, before they become foul, before they decompose, are very healthy. And Tosa says we should not rely on what Chazal say about medicine. And as we know today, it is extremely unhealthy to try to eat fish that in the beginning of the process of rotting. And Tosis once again says, maybe that was the situation in days of yore, but as we know today, we need to assume, nishtana hateva. Those are the 3 sources and Tosis that we find in Shas, but we find many more sources in different Paiskim and different Rishonim. 2 Tshuvas in Trumas Hadesha, and Chelak Aleph Reish Ayin Aleph, and Chelak Beis Kuf Samach Zayin. Trumas Hadesha says what we find in the Gemara, that if an animal nurses offspring, or any other baby animals, it is fair to assume, and we always will assume, that it already had offspring, and therefore the coming calf that will be born will not be considered a b'choyor. And the Trumas Hadesha says, today that is no proof, and sometimes we do find animals that will nurse even though they did not yet have babies. Yoledes Letisha eino yoledes lemiketon, which is also, once again, an assumption that we find totally against experience. And the Gemara says a woman that has a child in the 7th month of pregnancy might not necessarily need to fill the entire 7 months, but those that have children in the 9th month of pregnancy will always fill the 9th month. And once again, the Rashbash, Simen Tov Kof Yud Gimel, quoted in the Ramo Even Ezer Kuf Non Vav, say, that is not the situation, it is not what we know today. Chuvas HaTashbetz, he was the father of the Rashbash, Reb Shimon ben Semech Duran, one of the greatest Sephardi halachic authorities going back almost 700 years. Chelik Beis Simen Kuf Aleph writes, Harbe devorim motzinu sheneshtana hateva. Besides the sources that I have quoted, he writes, this is well known, and in many areas we know that things have changed since days of yore. Similar words we find in the Ritvo and Nideh Daf Nun Ches. All the sources I quoted up to this point, 7 sources, are from the Rishonim, and now just briefly some sources that we find in later generations, B'divrei ha'achronim. In Bava Basa Kuf Yutes, we find in the Gemara that a woman that had no children till she's 40 years old will not have children after the age of 40. And there's a tshuva in Chassam Sofer, Chelek Vav Sememem Zayin. The Chassam Sofer writes that if a person married a wife, a woman, and he assumes she is younger than 40, and he becomes aware after their marriage that she's more than 40 years of age, he could argue it's Kiddush HaToros. This was a mistake because I want to have children. And according to Chazal, a woman that had no children up to 40 years of age will no longer have children. And the Tzuras Shai was Reb Shloime Yehuda Tabak, the Av Beis Din in Sighet. He wrote amazing Sforim, and he says, well, today it has been proven that women can have babies after age of 40, even though they had no children before that age, and therefore we must assume shenishtana hateva. So I don't think there's a need to go on and quote more sources. So in many areas in Halacha, we find assumptions that Chazal assumed, and they assumed in previous generations, and what we know today about medicine and science, and from experience, not only from theory, that things are different. So many Rishonim say we must assume things have changed. When is it reasonable to say things have changed and when not? So you probably are aware of the big controversy, is the world flat or the world is round? So many years ago, Nicholas Copernicus argued that the world is round, and many years later, Galileo proved him right, and he paid a very harsh price for his arguments. Galileo, he was spent many years in a dungeon, and he was required by the church to retract and say in public that the world is flat. And as long as 300 years ago, we find that Shuvin the Shivus Yankov, and he says, well, everybody knows that the world is flat. So could someone suggest maybe the world was flat for thousands of years, and at some stage, HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided, let's make a change, and he blew up the world like a balloon, and it became round. Would we say it is reasonable to say Nishtana Hateva, like we find in many different areas? I think that would be extremely unreasonable. There are areas in which we could understand things change. Some genetic mutations become more mainstream and they become more common. Some things are affected by ecology or by lifestyles, and things could change marginally, but it would be extremely unreasonable to say that the fundamentals changed and HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to change his original plan. I think it'll be very unreasonable to say that maybe the world was flat, like many thinkers thought 1,000 years ago, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to blow it up and have a round world, and let's give it a try and see how it'll work, and it has been working since it has become round. So there are areas in which it is fair to assume that nishtana hateva, as we find in many sources that I quoted, and other areas in which it would be extremely unlikely. One of the fascinating Rabbonim, going back 100 years, was named Rabbi Kamelhar. He was a great Talmid Chochem, and he was extremely knowledgeable, relatively to Rabbonim of his age, and he wrote many Svarim. I, as a young bocher, had great inspiration from two of his Svarim named Dor Deya, and he describes the Tkufa from Tov Kuf to Tov Reish, Be'eref HaShishi, and he has two Svarim. One describes the world of Gedolim, and that spans the era from the Pnei Yeshua to the Divrei Chaim, and the equivalent sefer is about the Hasidic world. And I remember growing up, I read those books, and I was very inspired. One of the interesting Sforim he wrote was HaTalmud v'Mada'ei HaTevel, in which he deals with Torah and science. One of the early works. Rabbi Kamelhar was a Rav in Poland, and for 10 years he was in America, from Tov Reish Pei Zayin to Tov Reish, I think Tov Reish Pei Gimel to Tov Reish Tzaddik Gimel. And the last 5 years of his life he lived in Yerushalayim, and he's buried in Har HaZeisim. And in that sefer, he deals with the question of how is it possible that, according to Chazal, a child that is born in the 7th month of pregnancy has a fair chance of survival, and if he's born later in the 8th month, he is in dire straits. So he asked the Rogatchover, and the Rogatchover came up with this spark of genius, and he said there are two tracks of pregnancy, fast track and a slow track. In some airports, when you get to the airports, you have two tracks. One is faster than the other. So the Rogatchover said maybe there are two tracks, 7th-month track and a 9-month track. And those that are on the 9-month track, their life is in extreme danger if they're born prematurely. But those that are born in the 7th month will do well, because that is a different method of development and a different track. And the Tzavnas Meneach, as always, comes up with a Yerushalmi, היוומהשחור ד' עמוד בייס, וייצר אלוקים את האדם. The Yerushalmi says two Yuds, וייצר, echad leben zayin, ve'echad leben tes. It is a spark of genius, but biologically extremely unlikely, and we know nothing about two different tracks. And as we know, the longer a baby is in his mother's womb, the better off he is. And the later he is born, he has a better chance of survival. So how do we halachically deal with this issue? Maybe science hasn't changed, but many things have changed. And the advance of medicine, of technology, and the awareness of hygiene and sterilization, and having a sterile atmosphere without germs and bacteria. So maybe that makes the difference. Today we have far better medicine and technology and the knowledge of what causes mortality in infants, and not only in infants, and probably that is what has made this huge difference. And therefore, today, as we know that babies, premature babies, could be saved, it is clear that we are Machal Shabbos and do everything in our power to give them the best chance of survival, and even if that requires Chilul Shabbos. We still have two ways to define a baby that was born prematurely. It is clear in Halacha that, yes, we are required to do everything we can to save his life, and even if that requires Chilul Shabbos. No different than a fetus, and both the Ramban and the Ran quote Halachas Gedolos that we are Machal Shabbos to save a fetus, a ubar. Even though it is clear in the Mishnah in Ohalois Perek Zayin that a ubar is not defined as human life, and we destroy a fetus if it is necessary to save his mother's life, even though we never compromise one life to save another. But the Mishnah says if the fetus endangers the mother's life, then yes, we will terminate the pregnancy to save the mother. And that is a question I've been dealing with many, many times when a pregnant woman is found to have cancer and the doctors say the only way to save her life would be chemotherapy, and they can't do that to a pregnant woman, and the psak is, yes, we terminate the pregnancy if that is what is required. Chas v'shalom, we shouldn't know to save the mother's life. So on one hand, a fetus is not considered by halachic criteria a human being, a full-fledged human being. And on the other hand, we are mechalel Shabbos to save a fetus. And the Rishonim explain, Chalel olav Shabbos achas kedei sheyishmor Shabbosos harba. It is potential life, and potential life permits and necessitates, obligates Chilul Shabbos to give this fetus a chance. He is not yet a full-fledged human being. He is not a nefesh, but we are machal Shabbos for potential life. And according to what I wrote in my Sforim, that is the very same reason why it is a prohibition to destroy a fetus. Because if it's permissible to be mechalish to salvage him, doesn't that clearly say that he must be salvaged? And if he must be saved, he cannot be destroyed. So these three halachas are one and the same. The prohibition to destroy a fetus, the mitzvah to salvage a fetus, and the halacha that we are mechalash Shabbos in order to save him. These three halachas are one and the same, the way I see it. So would a ben shemoin, a premature baby, be different than a fetus? Or we're mechalash Shabbos to save a fetus, wouldn't it go without saying that we would do the same for a baby that was already born, even though he was born prematurely? So would we on one hand say the decree of Chazal is right? A ben shemoina doesn't have a din of a nefesh, but nevertheless, bearing in mind and knowing that he could be saved, that necessitates Chilul Shabbos in order to save him? Or would we say no, far beyond that, knowing what we know today and having the abilities we have today, he is already defined as a full-fledged nefesh, just like any other baby, any other infant. The nafkamina between these two approaches would be chayei shah of a premature baby. Do we need to go to the extreme to extend his life even though we know it's futile? We know it's futile. The baby will not survive. But we could push him a bit further. Another day, another week, but he's a premature baby. If he has a din of a nefesh l'kol davar, chayei shah mechal Shabbos. And we are mechal Shabbos for chayei shah regardless of the mental capacity of the patient, whether he is conscious or unconscious, whether he is in healthy state of mind or not. So would that also refer to a premature baby? If we say he has more or less the status of a fetus, then there is no chayei shah of a fetus. It is only if we could bring him to full life. So that would be the nafkamina. Shmini Shabbos Kelchosa, Perek Lamed Vav, Sif Yud Beis, Orachov Dalet quotes Reb Shlomo Zalman that there is no need to go to the extreme for chayei shah of a premature baby. It is only if we could give him a fair chance of developing and growing, to be a child, to be developed as any other baby. It is only then that we need to go to the extreme and try to give him life, even at the expense of Chilul Shabbos. And I agree with that psak. So up to this point, we dealt, how does Halacha deal with premature babies? And as we made clear, if we have a chance, even if it is not a great chance, and I cannot quantify it in percentage points, we will go to the extreme and try to save that baby, even at the expense of Chilul Shabbos. So things have changed since the days of Chazal. And obviously in their days, there was no chance in saving a premature baby that was born in the 8th month, but bearing in mind that things have changed, and regardless of why they have changed, has nature changed, or is it just the advance of medicine, technology, knowledge about the importance of a sterile atmosphere? Regardless of what the reason might be, bearing in mind that we have the ability to save premature babies, and with new advances in technology like the artificial uterus, we will have the ability to save children, babies that are born in a far earlier stage. Yes, that is a blessing which we will embrace, and we are to be Machal Shabbos to do everything we can to save premature babies. And now let's briefly discuss the other concept that might be defined as an artificial uterus, not really an artificial uterus, but uterine transplantation. And just recently I was involved with a young, wonderful woman that was born without a uterus, and that is known as Rokitansky syndrome. Approximately 1 out of 5,000 female are born without a uterus. And it is a very painful situation. So once upon a time, all we could offer these women would be adopting a child. And now we could offer surrogacy. And the most recent breakthrough is uterine transplant. So I was involved with many, many cases, many young girls that were born with this syndrome, sadly enough. And I remember one particular case, a very, very special young girl, had everything going for her besides a uterus. And she was suggested to a boy that was totally healthy. Just didn't find his shidduch. He was an el bocher, as they say in our society. He was 30 years old, and she was an outstanding girl in every sense. Erlich, intelligent, a nurse in a hospital, a beautiful girl, and each of them came to discuss with me, is this the right thing to do? And the girl said, I don't feel comfortable doing this to a boy that could have babies. Maybe it is my destiny to marry an alman or a gorush that already has children. And I told the girl, but you do have ovaries. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't plan you should have children, why would he give you ovaries and he didn't give you a uterus? If he did give you ovaries, I assume that he wants you to have children. Otherwise, he would give your uterus to someone else. Well, why did he give you ovaries? And I encouraged her to go for it. And the boy came to discuss with me, and I encouraged him as well. I told him, well, you're looking for a shidduch for quite a while, and this is a great, great girl, and you're going to have a wonderful life with her. And we have what to offer. You know, you could either use a surrogate, and Baruch Hashem, this young girl had a uterine transplant, and she is pregnant, and we all hope, Be'ezus Hashem, they will have a child of their own. And so this is a major breakthrough. And this child is discussed more than 100 years ago, and that is unbelievable. So somebody dreamed about this far before it was actually relevant. But the Rabbonim are very creative, and sometimes they are super creative. And in Shnas Tov Reish Samaches, and that is 115 years ago. It was, I think, in 1907. We find articles in two periodicals, Torah periodicals, V'yalket Yosef, that was printed in Boniad in Hungary, Tov Reish Samach, Oyhel Yitzchok, printed in Satmar, Tov Reish Samach Zayin, 116 years ago. And there's an article written by Harav Yankov Gordon from England, and he writes that doctors in England were successful in transplanting the reproductive system from one woman to another, and a mother donated her uterus to her daughter, and the Rabbanim deal with a whole bunch of questions. Question number one, could her husband have intimacy with her, or maybe it would be like Bo al Chamoisai, which is an ereva? Strange question. Because her reproductive system is her mother's, and it is totally legitimate. It's a chiyuv koros, it's an erva to have intimacy with your shvigar. So that is question number one. To me, seems very strange. And question number two, who would be the halachic mother of the child that was born from the uterus of one woman transplanted into the body of another? So I don't know who Rabbi Yankov Gordon was, but he made up this story, and 115 years ago, nobody transplanted any part of the reproductive system into another woman. But in days of yore, it was very easy to tell stories. You know, today one cannot lie. You know, in 10 seconds, we know everything. Mala fonem v'mala ochar, mala malo v'mala mato. But once upon a time, you could just tell any story. So he wrote a letter from London that we succeeded in transplanting the entire system from one woman to the other, and many of the Rabbanim engaged in this discussion. Rabbi Aryeh Weiss was a God B'Yisrael. He wrote a sefer, Even Yekora, and in Chelik Gimel Semachov Tes, he says, seems strange to me, I don't really believe the story. And he was right. It took more than 100 years, yes, till we had ovary transplants, and today we have uterine transplants. And these questions suddenly become relevant. So many Svarim 100 years ago and 70 years ago engaged in this question. Zelachan v'Zelachan, only in 2007 were they successful in ovary transplants. Sherman Silver was the name of the first doctor to do it. And this bears in mind, brings forth several halachic issues. So the young woman I was involved with that had uterine transplants, and several of them were successful. Some of them were taken from car accidents, from cadavers, and also from live donors. Is it permissible or pi halacha to donate your uterus to another woman? Sirus is an issa d'oraisa regarding the male system, regarding the female system, castration. The Rambam writes in Hilchas Isurei Bia, Potur, Magad Mishnah's Medayek Potur, Aval Osul. And that is in Shulchan Aruch Even HaEzer Siman Hey, Sif Yud Aleph. It is an issa d'Rabbanan castration of the woman's reproductive system. So would it be permissible to donate the uterus to another woman? So it is castrating one woman, but that uterus will receive new life in the body of another. The donor is past the period in which she will have children, but the uterus is still viable. And that is fascinating from the medical point of view. She's beyond menstruation, so she won't have kids, but the uterus is still viable, and it could function in the body of another. Would there be an issur of sirus when it is removed from one woman, but it'll give life to another? And that is a fascinating question. What is the issur of sirus? Be'isha, 3 different opinions. The Rambam, according to the Maggid Mishnah, maintains it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. And because the Shulchan Aruch quotes the Lashon of the Rambam, we would assume the same goes for the Shulchan Aruch. Tosis Yavamis Kuf Yud Aleph maintains no Issa at all. And that is the shit of the Taz, Even Ezer, Sif Kotten Vav, Simen Hey. Only the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, maintains it's an Issa D'Oraisa, and all the Rambam means Poter Mamalkus, but it's an Issa D'Oraisa. Al Pi Halacha, we maintain, like many other poskim, that it's not more than an Issa D'Rabbanan. And when we're dealing with the extreme Shasat Chak, we even rely on the Taz, that besides Choyvel B'Chaveiro, it's not an Issa at all. According to the Taz, it's just Choyvel. And if it is done by consent, to benefit an other woman, there definitely would be no Issa of Choyvel. So I think there is room for leniency to permit removing uterus from one woman to donate it to another if that is her only chance to have children of her own. So the medical opinion is a recipient that receives the uterus, it should be removed after 1 baby or maximum 2 babies because of many serious medical complications. Rejection, some argue it might even cause cancer. So after the recipient has 1 baby or maximum 2, it is recommended that the uterus should be taken out. Would that be permissible? Once again, because it is done for medical considerations, yes, we give a heter, and in that case there will be no Issa of Sirus. I also have a feeling, but this is just Argoshes Alev, and it is very difficult to prove because these possibilities were unheard of and undreamed of. They actually were dreamed of, as I said 100 years ago, but not far beyond that. So we don't really have proof. Libby Emily, if we are the ones that implanted this uterus, might not be an issue to take it out. You know, it's not the uterus you was born with. So on one hand, should be Einai, that any organ we transplant into one's body becomes part of his body. When we do a heart transplant, whose is the heart? So Mr. A, his heart was transplanted to Mr. B. When Mr. B dies, would the Yorshim of Mr. A have a claim, well, this heart is our father's heart, we want it back? No, it is no longer your father's heart. Any organ transplanted into another's body and it functions in that other's body is part of his body. Many years ago, I wrote a tshuva to Rav Tzvika Reisman, who I'm so happy to see in the audience here, my dear friend from Los Angeles that wrote many, many svarim, wonderful svarim. And I think I wrote a tshuva to you about ovarian transplant, and the ovary, different than any other human organ, all the woman's eggs she will have all her life are born with her. The ovary does not produce egg. They just develop, but all the egg a woman will have all her life, she has on the day she's born. So when we transplant an ovary from one to the other, whose are the children? Because the ovary is not producing new egg when transplanted into body number 2. It is only the egg from number 1. And still I insist, those children will be the children of mother number 2. And it is totally irrelevant that those eggs were in woman number 1. Any organ that becomes functional in a body of a recipient is considered to be her organ, regarding any halacha. And therefore, regarding yuchsin, these children will be the children of the mother. Ovaries are part of her body. The uterus is part of her body, regardless of where they came from. Another interesting question would be pidyon haben. So if woman number 1 had 10 babies, her uterus is taken out and put into woman number 2, and to her it's the first baby. Would that be peter rechem? Would there be a chiyuv of pidyon haben? Would we say, but this rechem, it's not peter rechem. This rechem produced 10 babies. And still I say, irrelevant. That was a different rechem. The new rechem in the new body is starting from A, from Bereshis, and to this woman, it is peter rechem. So once again, I have no proof. How could I have proof? This was unheard of, but libi yomeli, chayev bepidyon haben. I would even argue with the brocha, but I know this is uncharted territory. So we discussed the question of yuchsin, and I say it is all the recipient, question of pidyon haben, which might be different, and the ultimate question of sirus, and I think it would be permissible both for the donor and for the recipient after a baby or two to once again remove that uterus. So we discussed some very interesting questions which could not be discussed many years ago. It is only due to the remarkable and unprecedented advance of medicine, technology, and I see this as a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we should assume that when human beings have this unbelievable genius, it is all divine inspiration. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave this as a gift that should be taken advantage of to bring happiness to families. So a few days ago, I gave a shiur in Manhattan in Hilchos Tzedakah. And I made an interesting comment that there is a very clear list of priorities in tzedakah. What comes first, what comes second, what comes third. And many times I've been asked, where does fertility fit into the system? Helping couples to bring children to the world. And sometimes it is a very, very costly endeavor. So on our list of tzedakahs, where does it fit in? And I say, we have no sources for a very simple reason, because even going back 100 years, the only way you could help a couple have babies is by saying Tillim, and saying Tillim doesn't cost money. So we would find no source dealing with the question of where does fertility treatment fit in the list of tzedakahs, because this question was never relevant until our modern day and age. But I do think it fits in with refuah. Anywhere between cholesh yesh b'sekona and cholesh she'ein b'sekona, more than any cholesh she'ein b'sekona. If Chazal say, mi she'ein lo yibonem choshev kemeis, then we could assume how important this is and how essential and what a tremendous chesed it is to help a young couple bring children to the world and have nachas. So I think all these remarkable medical and technological breakthroughs are a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we should utilize and should take advantage of, and deal what are the halachic implications and the halachic questions and the halachic solutions to all these fascinating questions.